The ancient stone fortress of the Drakmor clan sat like a dying beast on the barren hills of Piraxis. Once this world had been green and full of life, with crystal lakes that reflected the wings of mighty dragons as they soared through purple skies. Now, the lakes were dry beds of cracked earth, and the sky held only the gray clouds of a planet slowly choking on its own dust. Elder Corvin walked through the underground chambers beneath his fortress, his footsteps echoing off walls that had once displayed proud banners of dragon riders. Those banners were gone now, sold to collectors along with most everything else of value. The sound that filled these halls was different too. Instead of the proud roars of bonded dragons preparing for flight, there were only weak cries and the rattle of chains. The holding cells stretched out in long rows, each one containing a dragon that had once been a proud partner to a Drakmor warrior. Some were massive beasts with scales like polished metal. Others were smaller and younger, barely past their first molting. All of them bore the same look in their ancient eyes, betrayal mixed with a sadness so deep it seemed to make the very air heavy. Corvin stopped in front of one cell where a golden dragon named Sunclaw pressed herself against the far wall. 3 years ago, she had carried Corvin's own son into battle against raiders from the outer systems. Now she would not even look at him. Her rider had died in the Great Famine, and without a bonded partner, she had become just another piece of merchandise in Corvin's desperate plan to save his people. The trade had started small. A few unbonded dragons sold to wealthy collectors who promised to treat them well. The credits had bought food for the starving clan and medicine for the sick, but the buyers always wanted more, and the prices they offered grew higher with each transaction. Soon, Corvin found himself selling dragons whose riders had died, then dragons whose riders were too old to fight, and finally, dragons whose riders simply could not afford to feed them anymore. A young Drakmor named Reth entered the chamber, his face pale with disgust. He had been one of the finest dragon riders before the trade began, bonded to a fierce red dragon called Flamewing. Now he served as a guard in these terrible cells, one of the few jobs left for those who refused to participate in the selling. The transport ship from the Trade Consortium is here, Reth said quietly. They want to inspect the merchandise before loading. Corvin nodded, hating the word merchandise, but knowing it was what they were now. How many this time? 12, including 3 juveniles. Reth's voice cracked slightly. The juvenile dragons were the hardest to see go. They had never known the honor of bonding with a rider, never felt the joy of soaring through space alongside a trusted partner. They would grow up in cages or fighting pits, never knowing what they were meant to be. The 2 men walked toward the loading area, passing cell after cell of imprisoned dragons. Some of the creatures followed them with their eyes. Others had given up and lay curled in the corners of their cages. The telepathic abilities that had once allowed dragons and riders to communicate as one mind now served only to amplify their shared misery throughout the fortress. In the main loading bay, representatives from the Galactic Trade Consortium examined the dragons like cattle. They checked teeth, measured wingspans, and made notes on portable data tablets. The lead buyer, a fat alien with too many arms, poked at the bars of young Flamewing's cage with a metal rod. "This one is spirited," the buyer said in broken galactic standard. "Good for the fighting circuits on Nexar Prime. The crowds love it when they still have fight left in them." Reth's hand moved to the weapon at his side, but Corvin caught his wrist. They could not afford to anger the buyers. The clan needed these credits to survive another month, to buy the protein paste that kept their children from starving, to purchase the fuel that kept their generators running. The transaction was completed with electronic transfers and shipping manifests. 12 dragons, including Flame Wing, were loaded into transport containers barely large enough for them to stand. The containers were loaded onto the consortium ship, and within an hour, another piece of Drakmor honor had been sold to the highest bidder. As the transport ship disappeared into the gray sky, Reth stood beside his elder and watched their peoples, shame carry their former partners away to unknown fates. How many more, Elder Corvin? How many more before there are none left to sell? Corvin did not answer because he did not know. The clan's situation grew worse each month. Their world was dying, their traditional enemies had grown stronger, and their young people were leaving for other systems where they might find work and hope. The dragons had been their greatest treasure, but treasures meant nothing to a people facing extinction. What neither of them knew was that their activities had not gone unnoticed by the wider galaxy. Deep space monitoring stations had picked up the unusual traffic to and from Paraxis. Trade route analysts had noted the sudden appearance of dragons in markets where they had never been seen before. Most importantly, the reports had reached the desk of a human intelligence officer who specialized in tracking slavery operations. The Terran Federation had strict laws about the trafficking of sentient beings, and dragons definitely qualified. Their intelligence, their telepathic abilities, and their complex social structures made them as much people as any spacefaring race. The fact that they were being sold by their own former partners made the situation even more disturbing. A classified file was created, surveillance assets were moved into position, and a very specific type of mission specialist was called in to handle the situation. The Drakmor clan thought they were alone in their shame, conducting their business far from the eyes of galactic civilization. They had no idea that their darkest hour was about to become the catalyst for something that would change their people forever. As night fell over the fortress, the remaining dragons in their cells shared their grief through telepathic connections that the Drakmor could no longer hear. But far out in space, another kind of mind was learning about their plight, and this one was connected to weapons systems, faster than light drives, and a human pilot who had never learned to ignore injustice. Space around Paraxis twisted and warped as the human stealth ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The vessel was sleek and dark, designed to slip through sensor nets without triggering alarms. Its name was Retribution, and it carried a single passenger whose mission files were classified at the highest levels of Terran Federation command. Commander Alex Grant ran through his final equipment checks in the mech bay, his hands moving over familiar controls with practiced precision. The Valkyrie stood 20 feet tall, its humanoid frame packed with the most advanced technology humanity had developed. Unlike the bulky war machines used by other species, Valkyrie moved with fluid grace, its joints sealed against vacuum and its armor plating designed to adapt to any environment. Grant had been chosen for this mission because of his unique background. He was one of the few human pilots who had experience working with telepathic species, having served as a liaison officer with the peaceful mind readers of the Century system. More importantly, he had never failed to complete a mission involving slavery or trafficking, no matter how powerful the enemies involved. The intelligence briefings had painted a clear picture of what was happening on Paraxis. A once proud warrior culture had fallen so far that they were selling their own bonded companions to survive. The dragons were being scattered across the galaxy, ending up in fighting pits, research laboratories, and private collections. Reports suggested that younger dragons were being used for illegal genetic experiments. Grant's jaw tightened as he reviewed the files again. The dragons were clearly intelligent, their telepathic abilities putting them on par with any sapient species. The fact that they had formed bonds with the Drakmor for thousands of years made their current treatment even more sickening. It was like watching a family sell their own children to strangers. Retribution moved into orbit around Paraxis, its stealth systems making it invisible to the planet's primitive sensors. Through the ship's advanced scanners, Grant could see the Drakmor fortress and the landing platforms where transport ships regularly arrived to collect their cargo. The whole operation was sickeningly efficient, like a well-oiled machine designed to process misery. The planet itself told a story of decline and desperation. The continents that had once been green were now brown and gray, marked by dried riverbeds and abandoned settlements. Atmospheric readings showed declining oxygen levels and increasing dust contamination. Paraxis was dying, and its people were dying with it. Grant began his descent in Valkyrie, using the planet's violent ion storms as cover. The mech's adaptive camouflage shifted to match the rocky terrain as it touched down in a canyon system several miles from the fortress. From this position, he could observe the Drakmor operations without being detected, learning their routines and identifying potential allies among the local population. Through Valkyrie's sensors, Grant watched the daily activities of the fortress. He saw Drakmor workers leading chained dragons from underground cells to loading platforms. He observed the buyers who arrived in expensive ships, examining the dragons like livestock before making their purchases. Most disturbingly, he witnessed the reactions of the dragons themselves, their body language speaking of despair and broken trust. But not all the Drakmor participated willingly in the trade. Grant identified several individuals who moved differently, who avoided looking directly at the caged dragons, who seemed to carry themselves with shame rather than purpose. These people might be the key to resolving the situation without unnecessary bloodshed. One young Drakmor in particular caught Grant's attention. The man wore the traditional armor of a dragon rider, but he served as a guard rather than participating in the sales. Grant watched him slip small pieces of food to the imprisoned dragons when the supervisors were not looking, saw him speak quietly to the creatures in what appeared to be words of comfort. This one still had honor despite the circumstances. Grant spent 3 days in observation, learning the schedules and security procedures of the fortress. He noted that most of the Drakmor guards were poorly motivated, going through the motions of their duties without enthusiasm. The real security came from automated systems and the consortium's own hired mercenaries, professional soldiers who cared nothing for the dragons beyond their monetary value. On the 4th day, Grant witnessed something that made his blood boil. A transport arrived to collect a group of juvenile dragons, creatures barely past their first year of life. The young dragons cried out telepathically as they were separated from their elders, a sound that registered on Valkyrie's sensors as a frequency that seemed to vibrate through Grant's bones. One of the juveniles, a small red dragon with golden eyes, pressed herself against the bars of her transport cage and extended her neck toward the honorable guard Grant had been watching. The man approached her cage against direct orders from his supervisors, placing his hand on the bars near her snout. For a moment, both Dragon and Drakmor closed their eyes, sharing some form of connection that transcended their current circumstances. Then the supervisors noticed and drove the guard away with harsh words and threats. The juvenile dragon, left alone in her cage, let out a cry that seemed to echo across the entire facility. It was a sound of absolute abandonment, of trust betrayed by those who should have protected her. Grant made his decision. He had seen enough to understand that this was not just about slavery or trafficking. This was about the destruction of something sacred, the breaking of bonds that had defined an entire civilization for millennia. The Drakmor were not just selling dragons, they were selling their own souls, and in the process, they were destroying both species. Valkyrie's systems came online with a soft hum as Grant began his final preparations. The mech's weapon systems were configured for precision rather than destruction, designed to disable rather than kill. Grant had no desire to harm the Drakmor people, who were as much victims of their circumstances as their dragons were. But the trafficking operation would end one way or another. As he prepared to emerge from hiding, Grant thought about the files he had studied during the journey to Paraxis. The dragons had once been partners to the greatest warriors in this sector of space. They had fought alongside the Drakmor against pirates and invaders, had explored distant systems together, had built a civilization based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Tomorrow, Grant would find out if anything of that partnership could be salvaged, or if both species were too far gone to remember what they had once been to each other. Dawn broke over Paraxis with the same gray light that had greeted the planet for years, but this morning would be different from all the others. In the fortress courtyard, another consortium transport ship sat ready to receive its cargo of dragons. The buyers walked among the cages, selecting which creatures would bring the highest prices in the fighting pits of distant worlds. Commander Grant watched from his hiding place in the rocky hills. Valkyrie crouched low behind a ridgeline. The young red dragon he had observed the previous day was among those scheduled for transport, her golden eyes dull with resignation. The honorable guard stood nearby, his fists clenched at his sides as he watched the proceedings. He was powerless to stop. Grant had spent the night finalizing his plan. This was not a military assault against an enemy stronghold. This was a rescue operation in hostile territory, complicated by the fact that many of the people involved were victims themselves. The Drakmor were not evil. They were desperate. The difference mattered in how he would handle the situation. The first sign of trouble came when Valkyrie's energy signature spiked as Grant powered up all systems. The fortress's primitive sensors detected the anomaly but classified it as interference from the morning ion storms. Security teams glanced at their readings but dismissed them as routine atmospheric disturbance. Grant moved Valkyrie into position on a hill overlooking the loading area. From this vantage point, he could see everything: the caged dragons, the consortium buyers, the Drakmor workers, and the transport ship waiting to carry away another piece of their people's soul. The moment had come to do something incredible. Valkyrie erupted from concealment like a metal demon, its fusion engines screaming as it bounded down the hillside in impossible leaps. The mech's appearance was unlike anything the Drakmor had ever seen. Where their technology was built for function and durability, Valkyrie moved with an organic fluidity that seemed almost alive. Consortium security guards opened fire immediately, their plasma rifles sending bolts of superheated energy toward the approaching mech. Grant smiled grimly as Valkyrie's adaptive shielding absorbed the attacks without slowing down. The human pilot's voice boomed across the courtyard through the mech's external speakers, first in Galactic Standard, then switching to the ancient Drakmor language. "I am Commander Grant of the Terran Federation. This trafficking operation ends now. Release the dragons immediately." Elder Corvin emerged from the fortress, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. A single alien mech dared to challenge the entire Drakmor clan on their own world? He shouted orders to his guards, commanding them to destroy the intruder. But what happened next defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. Valkyrie did not attack the Drakmor guards. Instead, Grant began systematically destroying the infrastructure of the slave trade itself. Precision shots from the mech's plasma cannon shattered the locks on dragon cages without harming the creatures inside. Energy beams sliced through the chains that bound the dragons while leaving their captors uninjured. Each shot was calculated to disable the trafficking operation while preserving every life, even those of the enemy. The consortium buyers scrambled for their transport ship, screaming orders at their security teams to protect their investment. But Grant was already targeting their vessel, sending carefully aimed shots into the ship's engines and cargo systems. The transport would not be leaving Paraxis with its planned cargo. As the cages opened, something extraordinary began to happen. The dragons did not flee in panic as everyone expected. Instead, they began to gather around the human mech, their telepathic voices rising in a harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Dragons that had been separated for months reached out to touch each other with wing tips and snouts, re-establishing connections that had been severed by captivity. The young red dragon was the first to approach Valkyrie directly. Despite her youth and the trauma she had endured, she walked slowly toward the towering mech with her head held high. Grant could see her through his cockpit displays, her golden eyes fixed on Valkyrie's optical sensors, as if she could see the human pilot inside. When the dragon reached the mech, she did something that stunned everyone watching. She pressed her snout against Valkyrie's armored hand in a gesture that every Drakmor recognized. It was the traditional greeting between dragon and rider, the first step in forming the sacred bond that had defined their civilization for thousands of years. Valkyries. Sensors immediately began registering readings that Grant had never seen before. The dragon's telepathic field was somehow interfacing with the mech's quantum processors, creating feedback loops that enhanced both the machine's capabilities and the creature's natural abilities. Grant felt something touch his mind, not the technological connection he was used to with Valkyrie, but something deeper and more profound. Through that connection, Grant experienced the dragon's memories. He saw Paraxis as it had been in its glory days, with green fields and crystal rivers. He felt the joy of soaring through nebulae alongside bonded partners, the satisfaction of protecting the innocent, and the devastating pain of betrayal when those same partners had locked her in a cage to be sold. But the dragon also experienced Grant's memories through the link. She saw Earth's blue skies and vast oceans, felt the human's determination to protect the innocent, and understood that this strange metal warrior had come not to conquer but to free. The connection between them grew stronger, defying every scientific principle that either species understood. Other dragons began approaching Valkyrie, drawn by the unprecedented telepathic harmony emanating from the first bonding. Their presence amplified the effect, creating a network of consciousness that included both the creatures and the mech's artificial intelligence systems. Grant found himself at the center of a mental communion unlike anything in recorded history. The Drakmor guards stopped trying to attack, their weapons lowering as they witnessed something they had thought impossible. Dragons were bonding with an alien, forming the sacred connections that their own people had declared lost forever. Even more shocking, the dragons seemed more vibrant and alive than they had been in years, their scales brightening and their eyes regaining the fierce intelligence that had made them legendary. Elder Corvin stood frozen in the doorway of his fortress, watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. The consortium buyers were fleeing toward their damaged ship, abandoning their contracts and their dreams of profit. The dragons were free, more powerful than ever, and they had chosen to ally themselves with a human warrior rather than return to their former captors. Grant's voice echoed across the courtyard again, but this time it carried a different tone. Instead of the harsh commands of a conqueror, his words held the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for the dragons themselves. People of the Drakmor clan, your ancestors rode these magnificent beings as partners, not property. Look at what you have become, and ask yourselves if this is the legacy you want to leave for your children. I offer you a choice. Continue down this path of dishonor, or remember what made your people great. The silence that followed Grant's words seemed to stretch for eternity. Dragons stood around Valkyrie like ancient guardians, their telepathic presence creating a field of awareness that every person in the courtyard could feel pressing against their minds. The young red dragon remained closest to the mech, her snout still touching the armored hand, her golden eyes reflecting something that looked almost like hope. Elder Corvin stepped forward, his weathered face showing confusion and anger in equal measure. For 3 years, he had justified the dragon trade as necessary for survival. His people were starving, their world was dying, and the dragons had become their only resource of value. Now this alien warrior appeared and spoke of honor as if survival meant nothing. "You know nothing of our struggles," Corvin said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Easy words from someone who has never watched children starve, who has never had to choose between principle and the lives of your people. We did what we had to do to survive." Grant felt the red dragon's reaction to those words through their strange new connection. The pain was immediate and sharp, not just from the young creature but from all the dragons in the courtyard. They had not been resources to be spent for survival. They had been family, partners, friends who had shared their lives with the Drakmor for thousands of years. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. "Your survival came at the cost of your souls," Grant replied, stepping out of Valkyrie's cockpit for the first time. The Drakmor had expected another alien, perhaps something large and intimidating to match the impressive mech. Instead, they saw a human not much different from themselves, wearing simple flight gear and carrying no weapons except those built into his machine. The red dragon turned toward Grant as he emerged, and something remarkable happened. The telepathic connection that had formed between them through Valkyrie's systems did not break when he left the cockpit. If anything, it grew stronger, more personal. Grant could feel her consciousness touching his own, sharing emotions and memories without the technological interface. Reth, the honorable guard who had been feeding the dragons in secret, dropped to his knees as he witnessed something he had thought lost forever. The bonding ritual was beginning, not between dragon and Drakmor as tradition demanded, but between dragon and human. The ancient patterns of telepathic connection were forming, creating links that should have been impossible. "This cannot be," whispered one of the elder Drakmor women who had emerged from the fortress to witness the commotion. "The dragons bond only with our bloodline. It has been so for 10,000 years. But the evidence was undeniable. Grant could feel the red dragon's mind within his own, could sense her thoughts and emotions as clearly as his own. She was young, but incredibly intelligent, possessing memories that went back generations through the telepathic connections dragons shared with their ancestors. Through her, he could glimpse the glory days of Pyraxis, when dragons and riders had soared together through the cosmos. Other dragons began approaching Grant directly, drawn by the unprecedented bond he had formed with their younger sister. Each contact strengthened the network of consciousness, creating a telepathic web that included not just Grant and the dragons, but Valkyrie's artificial intelligence as well. The mech had become part of the bonding, its quantum processors serving as a bridge between human and dragon consciousness. More Drakmor emerged from the fortress, including many who had opposed the dragon trade, but had been powerless to stop it. They stared in wonder at what they were witnessing, understanding that they were seeing something that would change their world forever. The dragons had not just been freed. They had found new partners who valued them as equals rather than, resources. Grant could sense the complex emotions flowing through the gathered Drakmor. Many felt shame for what their clan had become, mixed with hope that perhaps their people could find redemption. Others felt anger at the implication that an outsider could succeed where they had failed. But underneath it all was a growing recognition that the old ways were returning, transformed by human involvement, but recognizably the same sacred bonds that had defined their civilization. The red dragon moved closer to Grant, pressing her side against his shoulder in a gesture of complete trust. Through their connection, she shared a name with him, not in words but in pure meaning: Flame Wing. She had been called Flame Wing by her previous human handler, and she wanted Grant to know her by that name. Grant placed his hand on her warm scales, feeling the power and intelligence contained within her compact form. Through their bond, he shared his own name and his purpose in coming to Paraxis. He showed her images of Earth, of humanity's long struggle against oppression, and of his determination to see all intelligent beings free to choose their own destiny. The other dragons began sharing their own names and stories, creating a chorus of telepathic voices that painted a picture of a proud species brought low by the desperation of their former partners. But they also shared something else: forgiveness. Despite everything they had endured, they did not hate the Drakmor. They understood the desperation that had driven the clan to such extremes, even as they mourned the bonds that had been broken. Elder Corvin approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the impossible sight of dragons bonding with an alien. When he was close enough to feel the edge of the telepathic field, he stopped, his face showing wonder and fear in equal measure. "What are you?" he asked Grant quietly. "Someone who remembers what partnership means," Grant replied. "Your people and these dragons built something beautiful together. You can build it again, but only if you choose honor over survival, principle over profit." Flamewing turned toward Corvin, her golden eyes meeting his with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. Through the telepathic network, she projected a simple message that every person in the courtyard could understand. "We forgive you. We remember what we were together. We can be that again." The old Drakmor leader fell to his knees, tears streaming down his weathered face as he truly comprehended what his people had thrown away. The dragons had not abandoned them. Even after betrayal, imprisonment, and sale to strangers, they were still willing to offer forgiveness and partnership to those who proved themselves worthy. But forgiveness was only the beginning. Grant activated Valkyrie's long-range communication system, sending a coded message to the Terran Federation fleet waiting at the edge of the system. The real work of rebuilding the bond between dragons and their riders would require resources, time, and a complete transformation of Drakmor society. As the first human ships appeared as points of light in the sky above Paraxis, Grant stood surrounded by dragons and watched a proud people prepare to reclaim their honor. The incredible thing was not that a single human had defeated an entire clan. The incredible thing was that he had reminded them who they were meant to be. 6 months after the liberation of the dragons, Paraxis had transformed from a dying world into something resembling its former glory. Terran Federation ships hung in orbit, their cargo holds full of atmospheric processors, soil regenerators, and hydroponic equipment. The gray skies were slowly giving way to patches of blue, and the first green shoots were beginning to appear in the formerly barren valleys. Grant stood on the observation deck of the new Joint Command Center, watching, as a formation of dragons and mechs practiced combat maneuvers in the sky above. Flamewing had grown larger and stronger in the months since their bonding, her scales now gleaming like polished copper in the sunlight. She flew alongside Valkyrie, their minds linked not just to each other, but to the mech's advanced targeting systems. The partnership between human technology and dragon telepathy had proven more effective than anyone had imagined. Dragons could sense enemy intentions through their telepathic abilities, while human mechs provided the precision firepower needed to disable threats without unnecessary destruction. Together, they had become something entirely new in galactic warfare, a force capable of stopping conflicts before they began. Reth approached from across the deck, wearing the new uniform of the Drakmor Terran Alliance. The young man who had once been forced to guard imprisoned dragons was now a squadron leader, bonded to a magnificent blue dragon named Storm Rider. His transformation reflected that of his entire people, who had gradually reclaimed their honor through actions rather than words. "The latest patrol reports are in," Reth said, handing Grant a data tablet. 3 more slaver operations shut down in the Outer Rim, no casualties on either side. Grant smiled as he reviewed the reports. The Alliance had developed tactics that their enemies were finding impossible to counter. Dragons could detect lies and hostile intentions from vast distances, while human technology could disable ships and facilities without harming the people inside. Slavers who had once operated with impunity now fled at the first sight of dragon-bonded mechs on their sensors. The success had not been immediate or easy to achieve. Many Drakmor had initially resented the human presence on their world, viewing it as another form of conquest. Some dragons had been too traumatized by their experiences to trust any bipedal species, human or otherwise. Building the Alliance had required patience, understanding, and countless small acts of good faith from both sides. The breakthrough had come when Elder Corvin, who had been replaced as clan leader but remained as an advisor, publicly bonded with an elderly dragon named Wisdom Keeper. The dragon had been one of the first sold to the consortium, rescued from a gladiatorial arena on a distant world. When she chose to forgive Corvin and form a new partnership with him, it sent a message throughout Drakmor society that redemption was possible for anyone willing to embrace it. Grant watched as a group of young Drakmor and human pilots worked together to maintain their mechs and dragons in the hangar below. The language barriers had largely dissolved as the telepathic bonds allowed for direct mind-to-mind communication. Human engineers learned dragon anatomy and psychology, while Drakmor technicians mastered the intricacies of mech maintenance and operation. The Alliance had also attracted attention from other species throughout the galaxy. Representatives from dozens of worlds had visited Paraxis to observe the partnership between humans and dragons, many seeking similar alliances for their own defensive needs. The Terran Federation found itself flooded with requests for assistance. From species facing their own oppression or extinction, Flamewing landed on the observation deck with the fluid grace that had become second nature to all bonded dragons. Her mental voice touched Grant's consciousness with warmth and affection, sharing her joy at the successful training exercise. Through their bond, she also conveyed something else. A request from the other dragons to consider expanding their operations. "They want to do more," Grant said to Reth, interpreting Flamewing's telepathic message. "The dragons are asking if we can take on larger operations. Maybe start hitting the major trafficking networks instead of just the small-time operators." Reth nodded, his own dragon sharing similar sentiments through their bond. "Storm Rider has been showing me visions of worlds where entire species are being enslaved. The dragons remember many of these places from their time in captivity. They want to return as liberators instead of prisoners. The idea had merit, but it would require resources and support that the Alliance did not yet possess." Grant activated his personal communicator and contacted Admiral Chen aboard the Federation command ship in orbit. The conversation was brief, but productive, resulting in authorization to expand their operations to sector-wide anti-slavery missions. As the months passed, the legend of the dragon-bonded mechs spread throughout known space. Slavers and traffickers spoke in whispers of silent machines that could appear anywhere, disable their operations without warning, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The dragon's telepathic abilities made surprise impossible, while human technology ensured that rescue operations could be conducted with surgical precision. The most dramatic rescue came when the Alliance intercepted a massive consortium operation attempting to enslave an entire colony of telepathic humanoids. 50 dragon-bonded mechs dropped from orbit in perfect formation, their pilots guided by a network of draconic consciousness that allowed them to coordinate their actions with impossible precision. The entire operation was shut down in less than an hour, with thousands of prisoners freed, and not a single casualty on either side. Grant found himself promoted to Admiral of the Alliance Fleet, commanding operations from a new class of ship designed specifically to support dragon-bonded mechs. Flamewing had grown to full adult size and served as his constant companion, their bond now so strong that they could communicate across vast distances of space. The transformation of Paraxis continued as well. The world that had once been dying was now a center of learning and culture where young people from dozens of species came to study the principles of interspecies cooperation. Dragon eggs, once sold to the highest bidder, were now carefully tended in nurseries where they would hatch to find willing partners from multiple species. But perhaps the most significant change was in the Drakmor themselves. The people who had once sold their own partners to survive had become the galaxy's most effective advocates for the rights of all intelligent beings. They understood the cost of betraying trust, and they were determined never to allow such betrayals to happen again, anywhere in known space. Grant stood on his command bridge, watching as another formation of dragon-bonded mechs prepared to depart on a rescue mission to the far side of the galaxy. Flamewing perched beside him, her consciousness linked to both his mind and the ship's navigation systems. Through their bond, he could feel her satisfaction at what they had accomplished together. The incredible thing had not been the technology that allowed humans and dragons to bond. The incredible thing had been the willingness of both species to forgive past mistakes and build something better together. From the ashes of the Drakmor's darkest hour had risen an alliance that was reshaping the balance of power throughout the galaxy, one rescue mission at a time. As the last of the rescue, ships disappeared into hyperspace. Grant smiled and prepared to follow them. There were more worlds to liberate, more partnerships to forge, and more proof to offer that even the darkest circumstances could be transformed into something beautiful. The galaxy had learned that humans possessed something special, not superior weapons or advanced technology, but the ability to see potential where others saw only problems. They had looked at a fallen civilization selling its own soul and seen instead a people who could be reminded of their true nature. They had faced dragons broken by betrayal and offered not conquest but partnership. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of the Outer Rim from a haven for slavers into a network of free worlds, they would point to the day a single human mech landed on Paraxis as the turning point. But Grant knew the truth was simpler and more profound. The incredible thing had never been about one person or one machine making a difference. The incredible thing had been proving that honor, once lost, could always be reclaimed by those brave enough to choose it over survival. The Drakmor had not been saved by human intervention. They had saved themselves by remembering who they were meant to be. The dragons had not been rescued by superior firepower. They had chosen to trust again despite every reason not to. And in the depths of space, wherever beings were held in chains or sold as property, they could look up at the stars and know that somewhere out there, dragons and humans and Drakmor flew together as partners, carrying the promise that freedom was not just a dream but a destiny that could be claimed by anyone willing to fight for it. The legend continued to grow, carried by the survivors of 1,000 rescue operations to every corner of known space. When slavers saw the distinctive silhouette of a dragon-bonded mech on their sensors, they knew their time had come. The Drakmor Terran Alliance had become the sword and shield of the innocent, and their story proved that sometimes the most incredible thing of all was simply refusing to give up on the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today.